Here's something pretty neat straight out of the Soviet Union. This is a numitron. It's a numerical display tube that uses heated filaments like an old-fashioned light bulb to display a 7-segment number. I've hooked this one up here to an ESP32 just to demo it, but I've got plenty more that I've recently bought, and I'm going to hook them up into a display for my next video. But it kind of got me thinking, the fact that these even exist and I can go and buy them on eBay, it's actually quite amazing. And I honestly think you can draw a straight line from weird surplus Soviet technology being on eBay to the current mess that's happening in Ukraine right now. Now, I'm not a good leader. I don't know anything about military strategy or hardware, but I do know a lot about technology due to my background and career. So I'd like to make this video about the absolute mess that's masquerading itself as an invasion, but I want to talk about it from a purely tech-based point of view. I'll try my hardest to not comment on poor military strategy. Honestly, though, the Russians are not going to make that very easy for me. So I'll do the serious bit here. There's nothing good about this war. Seeing children and civilians being murdered and being in a position where I can't really do anything to help is absolutely excruciating. My wife and I wanted to take in a refugee, but unfortunately we're not in a position to do that. So, like probably most people watching this, we feel quite helpless, and it's just very unpleasant all round. I don't care about nationalities. I don't care whether you're Russian, American, British, whatever. If you support the side that bombs hospitals, I probably don't like you. If you don't, I probably do. Now, if you've been directly affected by the war and don't want to see someone possibly not talking about it in the most serious terms, I suggest you give this video a miss. But otherwise, let's get onto it. Okay, where am I going to start? Oh, God. Right, let's do the obvious first. Tanks and armoured vehicles. Okay, so going back to the end of 2021, I am no expert in foreign policy, but the general consensus amongst people that know what they're talking about seemed to be some kind of invasion was imminent. Now, a couple of months later, start of February, it became apparent that the UK, US, other Western countries have been sending in various anti-tank hardware that would absolutely annihilate unsupported armoured vehicles. So at that point, it was looking like an invasion would be a Pyrrhic victory at best. With that in mind, again, trying not to comment on actual strategy, I expected something like this if an invasion was actually to happen, which honestly I wasn't expecting. I thought moving an armoured column had looked something like this. Sending reconnaissance drones ahead, something that I'm not aware has been used much in warfare before, with decent optics, with decent modern technology, to spot out firing positions, set up artillery way behind the lines. Obviously, Russians have plenty of artillery. Expected that to be way behind the front line to start taking out firing positions. Then maybe send forward, I don't know, infantry, some kind of close air support. I'm not even sure how that works. To flush out any more, and then advance your armour. Advance the tanks so that the forests, the hills aren't littered with javelin missiles and NLAWs ready to turn tanks into a mobile blast furnace. Even then, I expected the tanks to have some kind of electronic countermeasures to anti-tank missiles. Again, I don't know that much about that kind of thing, but obviously aircraft have had that for decades. Okay, so that's what I was expecting. Here's what actually happened. So it turns out that 50-year-old Russian tanks, which had apparently been upgraded, didn't have night optics, so they all had to move during the day with pretty predictable results. I've not heard anything about drone recon. I know that was something I kind of guessed had happened. I've not heard anything. Artillery, well, they've certainly been using artillery to indiscriminately shell civilians. and occasionally a nuclear power plant. I watched that happen live. Okay, and then right, so that takes us then onto the first meme, cope cages. Okay, so looking at armoured vehicles in, say, Afghanistan and Iraq for the past couple of decades, it's quite common to use something called slat armour. And as soon as I saw these cages on the top of vehicles, I knew what it was. I actually used to work with shaped charges in my previous job as an oil and gas engineer. So here's where I have to explain how a shaped charge works for those that don't know. So when you see a classic RPG, that kind of thing, inside is a charge with a concave indentation that has a copper liner on the front. When the front of the projectile hits a target, the charge detonates, and this copper liner is turned into essentially a high-speed, high-temperature, high-pressure jet of molten copper, which is incredibly effective at punching through steel concrete, which nuclear reactors are made of, by the way, and yeah, that kind of thing. So slat armour is actually reasonably good at defending against RPGs. It can essentially deform the warhead and stop it from detonating. What it's not very good at is javelin missiles or similar anti-tank missiles, which apparently have tandem charges, so they have two explosive charges. From what I understand, it might actually make them more effective because this standoff distance at the front is often not optimised, but by forcing the missiles to detonate further away from the armour, they may actually increase the efficiency. Kind of all a moot point anyway, because javelins and NLAWs, as far as I'm aware, can go into something called top attack mode, which will explode downwards, and apparently will blow straight through a cage made out of bed springs, like the one we see here. So that takes us on to the next improvement. Explosive reactive armour, or cope bricks, as I've seen it called. So it's actually a really smart invention at the time, pioneered by the Soviet Union. I think it was about 50 years ago. I think the concept was first implemented. So the concept's quite simple. These bricks essentially contain an explosive charge, and if tripped by a projectile, they explode outwards. The actual mechanics are a little more complicated than that, but basically it actively reacts, explodes outwards, and deflects or deforms your incoming projectile. Completely useless against modern anti-tank weapons for the exact reason I just stated above, tandem charges. First charge detonates the explosive reactive armour, the second one goes straight through the armour and turns the tank into a blast furnace. So it's all well and good me saying this, but we've seen this in action. We've seen that these modifications have had no real effect. Of course, no electronic countermeasures whatsoever. Those never existed, as far as I'm aware, or they were written down as existed, but mysteriously were never deployed on the tanks. I wonder where the money for that went. So yeah, pretty much the result that every expert in the field expected, I think. Okay, so let's move on to the next part. So I've mentioned close air support, so let's go on to the Air Force. I didn't really know what to expect. We all knew that a pretty significant number of surface-to-air missiles had flowed into Ukraine in the months leading up to this. So I wasn't expecting to see dozens of helicopters flying around in the first few days. Anything that was flying around, I expected to see pretty significant countermeasures. Bearing in mind that things like Stinger missiles, they're actually technology from the 1960s. I know they've been upgraded, but they're not brand new cutting edge technology. What we actually got from most videos I've seen, any electronic countermeasures are seriously lacking. so many videos of aircraft being shot down without even deploying flares. Here's a famous one for you. Okay, something I'd seen one of these before. I remember as a kid seeing some documentary about the first ever helicopter with an ejection seat. It's a KA-52. Looks cool as hell. Here's one on the first day flying through Crimea. A few hours later, this image came out of one that had been shot down. A lot of these have been shot down. There's plenty photos available. Again, I'm not quite sure why they are flying around in contested areas where it's known that anti-air defences are rife, and I've seen no efforts to deploy any countermeasures. Again, we have what is possibly, as far as I know, a very well-designed aircraft with a pretty unique design and a good airframe, but none of the, if you like, the soft engineering's being done. There's no ancillaries. There's no ECM. There's no decent flare deployment. There's no infrared countermeasures. Astonishing, to be honest. Again, you can have all the helicopters you want, park them in a forward airbase, all next to each other, let them get destroyed in mass. That happened yesterday. And again, totally different pivot, but iron bombs in more indiscriminate bombing of civilians. Yay. Now, of course, I am only trying to talk about the technology here. This could purely be a tactic to try and encourage Ukraine to surrender. But regardless, before the war, I would have believed that Russia had plenty of guided bombs that they could use to take out strategic targets in cities. Incidentally, I don't think that's ever really justified. It should have normalised in World War II. But anyway, and instead we see this. Go Russia. We've talked a lot about old hardware. So, again, I am talking retrospectively a little bit here. I didn't know much about Russian military hardware before this. But here's what I would have expected to see some of, at least. So, there's various projects that the Russian government have been very, very keen to push. For example, air shows. They're extremely visible. They're extremely showy. The Su-57 is one of them. It has thrust vectoring, like several other Russian fighter jets. They're very keen to advertise that at air shows. What's thrust vectoring? So that allows the engines to be angled, offset from the direction of travel. So you get to do cool things like this. I have no idea whether doing this has any tactical purpose. It looks really cool, though. And another example of one of these vaporware projects, I'm just going to call them, because honestly I don't think they exist. They've clearly been receiving funding, they've clearly been talked about, but then actual delivery, where's the money gone? What's it been spent on? I don't know. I don't think these exist. The other one would, of course, be the Su-75. Maybe they'll send one of those over. And on the tanks front, again, Russia weren't really promoting the fact that most of their armour was going to be 50 years old. So we've seen images of this T-14, which is, again, tank design, not really my specialty, but wildly different design to any other tank. It doesn't exist, does it? Obviously, there hasn't been one in Ukraine. It's vaporware. There has been some technology that Russia has built since the Cold War. They did actually use some of their latest tech in this war to indiscriminately attack civilians. Russia's apartment-seeking missiles. The latest cruise missiles. There's a little webpage that I'll link in the bottom. There's not much known about them. They, as far as I understand, they were specifically designed to evade NATO countermeasures. We don't know much about them. There isn't even really a decent image or rendering of them knocking around anywhere. Probably until now, because As far as I understand, several have failed to explode. Several have been shot down despite these countermeasures. And let's be honest, at least one of them is probably in NATO hands now and being crawled over by various engineers to reverse engineer it. Fantastic. Russia is well known for leading in the field of web security and encryption. So naturally, their communications have largely been completely encrypted on open radio channels throughout this. Volunteers have been listening in, translating and reporting to the Ukrainian military. You can justify this yourself. I saw it live. You can go to a relevant software-defined radio website, tune into whichever frequency people are talking about in the chat, and listen to Russian troops talking to each other. I saw someone live jamming a comms channel with Europop music. Somebody probably bled out while listening to Caramel Dancing. This is real, honestly. Now, I will admit, it could actually be someone with a lower power transmitter near the receiver, but regardless, so yeah, they're not actually jamming, they're just playing something near the receiver so anyone listening hears that. Regardless, the open communications are probably the reason that Russian generals keep getting domed by snipers. Oh, and actually one more thing, these rifles were designed in the 19th century. If we go back to the Soviet Union, which honestly doesn't seem that different to modern day Russia, we'll get to that later, they had some of the best scientists and engineers on the planet. Russia still probably does, to be honest. The thing is, as someone that works in the tech sector, good scientists and engineers are only the first part of your technology roadmap. You need your logistics, finance, public support, leadership, continuous development. These all cost a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of effort. So the Soviet Union had some absolutely amazing tech successors. The space program was probably the most impressive. I am not going to sit here and start dunking on someone that figured out how to build an oxidizer-rich closed-cycle rocket engine 40 years before the West. I still don't know how they managed to do that. But there was also a tendency to build engineering marvels that got abandoned right at the finish line. I know about this. I come from a country that does the same thing to a lesser extent. Thrust vectoring and automated tank turrets look really cool, but if you look here, and I'll put the coordinates in the description, you can find more pet projects that looked cool. Abandoned in a boneyard. This is an Su-47, the only one of its type. Tu-144. Admittedly a pretty garbage project, but it was the fastest airliner ever built. And there's a Buran as well. I didn't even know that was there until I looked. Here's some more Soviet projects that died alone in a shed. So the Buran that I just mentioned, here's the one that went to space. Shed roof collapsed and destroyed it a couple of decades ago. Went to space once, by the way. Some ways this was superior to the space shuttle. But here it is now. The Lun Classic Ranaplan. Absolutely incredible concept. Ground effect vehicle designed to fly just above the surface of the sea. Not a plane, not a boat. Dead on a beach. Bartini VVA-14. Bit of a quirky project, to be honest. One of the more unusual aircraft ever designed. And here it is now. And various other dead in a shed projects. Observers, we all like to talk about Putin's desire to bring back the Soviet Union. I'm not going to comment on whether that's true or not. He's certainly carried on that tradition by adding to the killing a great project in a shed list. Kharkiv city centre is a nice example. That used to look how I imagined a communist utopia to look. When I say communist utopia, I mean the ones in the propaganda posters. Spaced out blocks of affordable housing, efficient street design, tons of green space. So obviously that had to be destroyed. But the worst one of all, the Antonov AN-225. My best girl. For anyone unaware, it was the largest plane ever built. It was originally constructed to carry the Perun. It's since been used by Ukraine for all kinds of civilian and humanitarian projects. Absolute marvel of engineering, loved the world over. Avert your eyes if you're sensitive. Dead in a big shed. I think there's a real link between my stupid collection of Soviet tubes and the stupid mess in Ukraine. For the past 2 decades, it's been possible to go on eBay and buy whole boxes of these things unused. Most of them actually come from Ukraine, because that's where they were made. Why was there such a surplus, though? And why are they still sitting in warehouses now? I think it's the same reason that Russia fields thousands of 50-year-old tanks and only a handful of modern vaporware knock-ups. The economy of the USSR under communism was largely push-driven. Factories were told to produce X number of units per month, rather than meeting demand. The USSR was very good at producing vacuum tubes, produced a lot of them. The problem is, it almost feels like nobody ever told them to stop. So factories such as the Gazatron factory in Ukraine kept producing these things in bulk right through the 1980s. Honestly, if the USSR hadn't collapsed, I sometimes wonder if they'd still be putting them out today. It's another example of having scientists and having decent engineers but not having much else. Russian Nixie tubes in particular, they were extremely well performing when they were first made. Times change. When something was done, it was perfect and it was done forever in the minds of certain higher-ups. Add to this government officials siphoning off their cut, which was obviously rife in the Soviet period, and things don't really look so different to today. In my opinion, all flavours of totalitarian government are pretty similar. Non-existent ECMs on rows of 50-year-old tanks look the same to me as warehouses full of 50-year-old display tubes. I do want to stress that things like Nixie tubes were obsolete 50 years ago, when they were made. So how much of this was to line someone's pockets? We'll probably never know. We can always speculate. If you compare these Soviet Numitrons to the US designs, the early US ones were in tube format. In fact, they were invented in the US. But soon the Minitron format became more popular. It looks like this. It's more rugged. It's easier to add to existing applications such as aircraft control panels. Not that many were produced, as their applications were limited, and they were soon superseded by LEDs. For that reason, you can't buy that many US ones on eBay. They're more expensive. Soviet ones always stayed as tubes. They never switched to the US flat panel design. I really can't see that many applications for these in the 1980s. When they were made, they're just too fragile. So, despite many unused Soviet Numitron tubes existing today, it's difficult to actually find them in military or consumer hardware. There's articles all over the internet saying they were used in aviation, they were used in fire control, they were used in factories. I've found barely any images of these things being used in American hardware, let alone Soviet hardware. Now, admittedly, they are the kind of thing that tend to be boring applications. Yeah, heavy factory equipment, instrumentation, the kind of thing that's not particularly sexy. But it's easy to find examples of Soviet products with Nixie tubes in. Numitrons were only really a practical display technology for a short number of years. But the fact that they had such a long production run in the USSR, to me, it points to being part of a glorious future that never happened. I suppose that's why people like me enjoy using them. It's like playing with toys from a slightly different parallel universe. I don't know what these were intended for, but it is fun to put them in a pretty display. And now there's an added bonus that buying these from a Ukrainian seller, which I did at the start of the war, it does a tiny part to help out a country that really needs all of our help right now. Thanks for watching.